Good evening. I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. My colleague and co-host, Thaddeus McCotter, WJR, the great voice of the Great Lakes, is with me. Thaddeus, it's the night before a Republican primary in Mississippi and the open primary that turns out to be the Republican primary in California. What is your intuitive read, all these years recovering politician, on the nights before primary? Do people get anxious? Do they think anything can happen? Do they despair? Are they regretful, especially when the contests are close, which they are in Mississippi and California?
Well, I think they're too busy right now, still trying to get out their vote. Later tonight, start to worry about what will happen tomorrow. And I think the time for any second-guessing, ruing, or regret generally comes after the outcome, especially if one is defeated.
This is 4 years now of the Tea Party. The success in 2010, I will date as the invention or the creation or the birth of the Tea Party. 4 years later, Thaddeus, your read from Detroit, you were never part of the Tea Party. You watched it in 2010. Is it the same today from your point of view as it was in 2010?
No. I think I was one of, if not the first member of Congress to address the Tea Party. It was in Kellogg Park in Plymouth, Michigan. And you could see that these were ordinary people who were very frustrated, very concerned about the direction the country was going to take. And these were people whose really involvement, the spark that drove them into activism, really started with the Wall Street bailout and their opposition to it. But over time, what you continue to see is the political hacks, the political class tends to co-opt, tends to corrupt, and tends to beat up on the Tea Party to try to divide and to conquer it.
And the establishment of 2010, it's had a bad patch, especially 2012. Is it better organized than you remember it?
It's had to necessarily. Now, that is the great advantage. There's two great advantages that the establishment has over the Tea Party. Is one, money, obviously, but two, organization. It's built as a party structure, and even the political class within, the ruling classes within the parties, operate highly tightly organized, very vertical. The Tea Party is much more like the way the rest of the world is going during the Great Leveling. They're very horizontal. They're very organic, the real ones, and they do not necessarily coordinate. They do not necessarily unite. They'll coalesce around candidacies or issues, but they do not work in a highly organized, efficient fashion with each other.
We welcome David Drucker of the Washington Examiner. David, two races you followed very closely. One, because you're from California, but the first, Mississippi, you traveled there. We spoke last week. I'm watching these closing hours. Mr. Cochran, the incumbent, Senator Cochran, Thad Cochran, has all of the Republican establishment of the state campaigning for him, whereas State Senator McDaniel, the only thing I've seen for him are outsiders, or people not from Mississippi, Sarah Palin and Rick Santorum. Does that change the complexion of this race in your point of view, David?
Not necessarily, although in years past it might have. All of the polling we've seen to come out of Mississippi in the past few days has shown a close race. My sources that are monitoring private numbers say it's a close race, and I think it's going to go down to the wire. The one thing I point out about this campaign, there's been no early voting because Mississippi doesn't have it, and very little absentee voting. It's really an election day race.
Senator McDaniel, his conduct is difficult to read. Is he a Tea Party? Is he a Mississippi conservative who has accepted Tea Party support? Is Tea Party part of the conversation there, David?
Well, it very much is, and it's a role and a mantle that Chris McDaniel has tried to grab and run with it. Look, Mississippi is conservative territory, and it's friendly terrain for a conservative insurgency, generally speaking. And I think Chris McDaniel has done a good job of capitalizing on a lot of people that are really upset with Washington and want to shake things up. I mean, you've got a senator that's been there six terms and is asking for a seventh term. It puts the race in a very stark contrast. You've got an insurgent, or you've got an establishment guy that's been there since the Nixon administration, and Chris McDaniel's trying to use that symbolism to his advantage.
Thaddeus, a long-serving member of Congress like this, I'm sympathetic to people who think, well, really it's time to move on. And Senator Cochran said he was thinking about retiring. Does that tell you when somebody talks about retiring in Congress that it's time to go? Is that a tell, Thaddeus?
Yes, if you think about it, you should. In my own case, I had about one term left in me. And I think that those are the types of things that you have to recognize. Now, to say that or to say it prior to a primary is never a good sign. And I think that when, as David points out, when the people watch, it's going to be very closely contested race. It's going to come down to election day, and we know what that means. The most motivated voters will show up. And that does not necessarily bode well for a 30-some-year incumbent.
Right. And David, right now the polls tell us nothing except that it's close. Right? That it was close when you went down there. It was close when it started.
In a sense, yeah, we're right back where it started. There's just a lot more action going on down there. And it's a cliche to say this, but it really comes down to turnout, but I mean it in this way. We've never had a competitive Republican Senate primary in Mississippi, so there's no historical precedent to draw on. We're really in unknown territory here.
We go to California, David's state, California, and the contest there is odd because it's an open primary, which means that the first two finishers will be in the general election. They can be two Republicans, they can be two Democrats. In this instance, Jerry Brown, running for his fourth term, is easily going to win overall. The question is who comes in second. Right now, the contest is between Tim Donnelly, a state assemblyman, who has said very provocative things over the years, a man who was once associated with an organization called the Minutemen, pre-Tea Party anxiety, and a newcomer, a non-politician, Neil Kashkari. And that's my question to you, Thaddeus, before I go to David on this. A non-politician, is that a good thing to be for the Republican Party these days?
Well, it is, and it isn't, and I don't know if it's apt to say in Mr. Kashkari's part, because as you remember, John, you remember him from TARP.
He is TARP.
Yes, he's very close to Mr. Paulson.
Right, he is TARP.
So just because that's one of the things that I always found fascinating, and David can correct me if I get a little wrong here, but just because you're not an elected official doesn't mean you're not a politician. In fact, some of the most political people are the least accountable because they are not elected, and yet they control more power and wield it more often than anybody who holds an elected position.
Now, David doesn't want to answer this question because California gives him the creeps. I know. Here you go, David. You're on the line. You're the professional. A non-politician, Neil Kashkari, running against Tim Donnelly, who's nobody's idea of a top-of-the-ticket politician for the Republican Party. Do you have a feel for this one, David?
No, although it looks like Kashkari is in a better position than when we last spoke about it. Look, if you're a non-politician, the beauty of being a non-politician is you don't have a record, and you get to scream at everybody in power and say you do it differently. Kashkari's problem, if we're looking at that through this prism, is he's not an outsider, and he does have a record. And so this isn't your typical insider-outsider race. It's the elected official in this pairing is actually the guy with less of a record and an easier time screaming at everybody in charge.
That is my struggle with Donnelly, is that I look at the quotes and things he's said over the years, and it's unacceptable language. It's bizarre, Thaddeus. I'm told that if he wins the Republican nomination, what's left of the California Republican Party is finished.
Well, it goes back to William F. Buckley Jr.'s dictum: vote for the most conservative person who is electable. And that's a decision California are going to have to make. And in this case, it's going to be not necessarily about beating Governor Brown, although that's always the hope. It's going to be about what type of party they're going to be. Are they going to be able to build it? Are they going to have a standard bearer that does not, as you point out, John, further damage the party, further disintegrate it, but at least provide a respectable showing so that they can start to build and repair whatever they need to do to become competitive again?
David, this is a near-death experience for the California Republican Party. Does it know this? Is it aware of this?
I'm not sure, but it's indicative of much of what the Republican Party has been dealing with over the past few years with its growing pains, and that there's a sizable, or at least a very vocal part of its coalition that is afflicted with what I call dead-enderism, and that is people who think the country is on such a precipice that they need to scream from the rooftops in whatever manner they feel is required, because we may not make it to the next election, and that if you don't think there's actually another election and another election to correct what's wrong, then you're willing to say anything that you think needs to be said, even if that offends the people you actually need to attract to stop what's going on, and that's part of the problem the Republicans are having.
David Drucker of the Washington Examiner. Mississippi and California, 2 primaries tomorrow that will tell you a deal about the fate of the Republican Party for the 16 cycle. Thaddeus McCotter, WJR, the great voice of the Great Lakes. I'm John Batchelor.